Ponzi schemes, property tax myths, and the intergenerational equity problem. Hi everyone, welcome. It's Aidan here from iStrategic. Over the past few weeks, I've been really closely following the discussion around potential tax reforms expected to be handed down in the May 12 budget. I've spent a lot of time reading, listening, reviewing perspectives from both sides, and really trying to understand the likely direction and implications for us as property investors. Today, I'm going to share my views. So as always, these are my views only. This is not financial advice or tax advice and should be considered with discretion. First, to broadly frame the discussion, the government is looking at making fairly substantial changes to the way property investing is taxed in Australia, with the aim to improve or provide more intergenerational equity, as they call it. The desire is to make housing more affordable and more accessible for homeowners and renters. What stands out to me, though, is that both the proponents and the opponents of these tax changes largely agree on one thing from what I've seen, is that they are unlikely to materially improve housing affordability or reduce rents. They may at the margins, but not make a substantial impact. In fact, in many cases, the argument is that they could in fact be inflationary. So here's what a few experts are saying. Shane Oliver, the AMP chief economist, his view is that increasing taxes on investors risks acting as a disincentive to work and productivity. More importantly, he claims that it could reduce housing supply, which ultimately pushes up prices. The key takeaway here being that supply remains the dominant force in both house prices and rental markets, which is something I talk about all the time. Shane Wright, the senior economics correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, Wright has been vocal, often even labelling the Australian property market as a Ponzi scheme, pointing to that multiple capital cities now have median prices above $1 million for a house. However, despite his fairly negative stance, he also still acknowledges that the tax changes are unlikely to significantly reduce prices or rents due to the stronger underlying forces. He believes these changes need to be accompanied by much broader package of reforms in order to have any real impact. Then there's PIPA, the Property Investment Professionals Association of Australia. PIPA strongly opposes the reforms, highlighting that over 90% of investors are everyday Australians that own 1, 2, or 3 properties. Their concern is pretty straightforward, that if you disincentivise this group, then rental supply falls and rents will rise. And Michael Matusik, property analyst and demographer, Matusik provides one of the more balanced takes, which I really like. He challenges several common myths. Here's a couple. That negative gearing is not unique to Australia. It is actually pretty common, which I found out. Some version of negative gearing is common amongst a lot of developed nations. Removing the CGT discount is unlikely to increase housing supply, and that investors are simply more likely to hold their assets longer instead of sell and realise those gains. His key point is worth highlighting. Quote, housing markets move primarily because of credit conditions, and especially due to the interplay between supply and demand. Tax policy tends to sit around the edges, end quote. He also points to the real drivers of property price growth in Australia since 1999 being falling interest rates, rising incomes, lower unemployment, easier access to credit, longer mortgage terms, and increased borrowing capacity for individuals. In my view, I tend to agree with his assessment. From what I see for myself and working with my clients, is that people don't invest in property because of the tax benefits. We invest in property because of the long-term capital growth potential and the cash flow. Tax incentives are like the icing on the cake, not the cake itself. So what could be a more effective approach? If the government's goal is to improve affordability and increase supply, a more targeted approach could be retaining the tax incentives like negative gearing and the CGT discount, but only for new builds. This would direct capital into new housing supply, support construction activity, and it would avoid distorting demand for existing stock, because you wouldn't have investors and owner-occupiers competing for the existing stock pool. Okay, what if the changes do happen? May 12 comes along and the changes are put in place. Well, here's how I say it. If negative gearing is removed or CGT concessions are reduced, I certainly don't see it as the end of property investing. It simply means that your strategy will need to adjust. For example, consider ownership structures like bucket companies instead of owning the property only in your own personal name. Because if those tax incentives go, then it becomes actually more a better tax environment to perhaps own in a company structure. Next would be extending your investment time horizon to delay realizing those capital gains. And thirdly would be focusing even more intently on the asset selection and the growth fundamentals and the cash flows on that property and that area, which is what I do anyway at iStrategic. If long-term confidence in property remains, investors will adapt. They won't exit. Finally, the current debate is really heavily focused on taxation, but history suggests that tax policy plays a secondary role, whereas supply, demand, and credit conditions really drive the market. And that's where I continue to focus my attention and where I believe the real opportunities will lie before May 12 and certainly after May 12. If you'd like, I can share a more detailed breakdown of how these potential changes could impact different strategies and markets. Just reply to the email and I'll send it through. But that's it for me. Thanks very much for listening. Have a great weekend.